Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a story today that you all wanted to hear more about, and I'm really excited to get into it.
Oh, yeah, me too.
So we're looking at the passion and death of Jesus specifically, as it's told in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 26 and 27.
Okay.
Now, you guys already know the basic story. We're not going to give you the Sunday school version here.
Right.
We want to get into some of those deeper layers of meaning that Matthew brings to this really well-known narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that Matthew really excels at, is kind of bringing those extra layers in.
Yeah, and I was struck, as I was prepping for this, by how Matthew seems to emphasize certain things that maybe other gospel writers don't necessarily focus on as much.
Okay.
Like prophecy and the motivations of some of those key players like Judas and Pilate.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think he has a very particular agenda, and knowing his purpose is really helpful in understanding what's going on here.
Yeah, so let's kind of set the stage. We're in Jerusalem during Passover. Tensions are already running high between Jesus and the religious authorities.
Right.
And Matthew doesn't waste any time reminding us that Jesus predicts his own crucifixion, referring to himself as the Son of Man. I mean, talk about foreshadowing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, right from the get-go, he's setting a tone of inevitability. Like, this is going to happen. These events are not random. They're part of a larger plan.
Yeah, that sense of purpose,
Yeah.
And how everything is kind of leading to this moment, it really comes through in the next scene, the anointing at Bethany.
Okay.
I've read this story a bunch of times, but something struck me differently this time around. Like, it's not just a simple act of kindness, right? This woman is using incredibly expensive perfume to anoint Jesus.
Yeah.
It's extravagance,
Yeah.
It's almost over the top.
Right.
And then Jesus interprets this as preparation for his burial.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating juxtaposition, right? You have this lavish display of devotion happening, and Jesus is about to, go through his passion and death.
Right.
And by connecting this to burial customs, Matthew's really highlighting the woman's understanding of who Jesus is and what's about to happen.
It's like she's acknowledging his impending sacrifice.
Yeah.
But she's also honoring him in this very public, very costly way. And I wonder, what do you think Matthew's trying to convey through this contrast between, extravagance and impending sacrifice?
That's a great question. I think it really emphasizes the depth of her devotion and faith, even in the face of, what's going to happen.
Okay.
It kind of speaks to the idea that even small acts of love and service can have immense significance, especially when offered with a pure heart.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think about, how are we supposed to respond to this story? As readers, are we called to make grand gestures?
Yeah.
Or is it about those smaller, everyday acts of devotion?
Yeah.
It's definitely something to ponder.
Right.
And we can't talk about the passion without talking about Judas's betrayal.
Of course.
This is where Matthew's portrayal gets really interesting. He doesn't just tell us that Judas betrays Jesus. He emphasizes the calculated nature of it.
Right.
He highlights how Judas negotiates a price, 30 pieces of silver, for handing Jesus over to the authorities.
Yeah.
And that always kind of gets to me because it adds this element of premeditation,
Right.
almost cold-heartedness.
Yeah.
And it makes me wrestle with Judas's motivations. Was he always destined to betray Jesus, or did he make a free choice with, ultimately tragic consequences?
Yeah, it's a question that theologians have debated for centuries. Is Judas a villain fulfilling this preordained role, or is he a complex individual making a devastatingly wrong choice? I think both interpretations can be seen in Matthew's gospel and really force us to grapple with those big questions, of free will versus destiny.
Yeah, and how much responsibility do we have, for our own choices, even when they have, massive consequences?
Right.
So much to unpack there. But speaking of heavy stuff, let's move on to the Last Supper.
Okay.
This is where Matthew really focuses on the institution of the Eucharist. The sharing of the bread and wine, which Jesus says represent his body and blood.
Right.
And this scene always feels so intimate and profound, especially knowing what's about to happen.
Yeah.
It's like Jesus is saying, remember me, remember this moment.
Yeah, it's much more than just a remembrance, though he uses the word covenant when he institutes the Eucharist.
Right, and that's a loaded term, especially for, Matthew's audience, who would have been, Jewish Christians at the time.
Absolutely.
So can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us? What's the significance of that word covenant?
Yeah, so in the Old Testament, a covenant is this binding agreement between God and his people.
Okay.
It's a promise with mutual obligations. And Jesus is using that language to establish a new covenant.
Okay.
Not based on laws and rituals, but based on his own sacrifice. So it's a radical shift in how people relate to God. And Matthew is really emphasizing this new relationship.
I see how each detail he includes kind of adds to this bigger picture.
Yeah.
So it's not just a series of events.
Yeah.
He's building an argument for who Jesus is and what his death means.
Precisely.
But even amidst this solemnity of Last Supper, there's this element of dramatic irony, right? Because Jesus predicts that Peter, his most devoted disciple, is going to deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. Oh man, talk about foreshadowing. Like, he's going to mess up.
Right.
But it still hurts to read it.
Right.
It adds all this tension and suspense because we know what's coming, but we still want to see how it plays out.
Absolutely.
And it makes you wonder, how could Peter, who's like so committed to Jesus,
Right.
make such a colossal mistake?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's what we're going to explore next as we move into Gethsemane and kind of the events leading up to Jesus' arrest.
Yeah, so we left off with Peter about to make this mistake.
Yeah.
And Jesus predicting it.
And so then the story moves to Gethsemane, and we see Jesus' humanity really on full display. He's agonizing, he's praying, he's wrestling with what he knows is to come.
Yeah, you really get a sense of the emotional weight that's bearing down on him.
Oh, yeah.
He even asks God if there's another way,
Right.
but ultimately submits to his will.
Yeah, and this is where this idea of Jesus's dual nature really comes into play. He's fully human, experiencing real fear and anguish.
Right.
But he's also fully divine, committed to a mission that goes beyond his own personal desires.
Yeah, it's a complex idea.
It is.
But I think Matthew doesn't shy away from that complexity.
Yeah.
He presents us with a Jesus who's relatable.
Hmm.
Someone who grapples with doubt and fear just like we do.
Absolutely, and that makes his sacrifice all the more meaningful.
Yeah.
It wasn't just this detached, emotionless act. It was a deliberate choice made out of love and obedience.
Yeah, and then just as Jesus predicted, Judas arrives with a crowd.
Right.
Leading to that, iconic moment of betrayal with a kiss.
It's such a powerful image, isn't it? So full of symbolism. The kiss, a gesture of love and friendship, is twisted into this act of betrayal.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking, and it sets in motion, this whole chain of events that will lead to Jesus' death.
And what follows is this whirlwind of trials.
Right.
First before the Jewish high priest.
Right.
Then before Pontius Pilate,
Yeah.
the Roman governor.
Yeah, and these trials are so fascinating because it really highlights the clash between, religious and political authority.
Right.
And Jesus is caught right in the middle.
Yeah.
And Matthew really emphasizes his silence.
Yeah.
His refusal to kind of play by their rules.
There's that one scene where Pilate asks Jesus directly,
Yes.
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
Right.
And instead of giving a straight answer, Jesus just replies, "You have said so."
Yeah. It's brilliant, isn't it?
It is.
Because he's not denying the claim,
Right.
but he's also not validating Pilate's authority to judge him.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about Jesus' understanding of his own identity and his mission.
I never thought about it that way. It's like he's saying, my kingdom is not of this world.
Right.
It's this subtle challenge to both, the religious and political powers that be.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how does this scene, how does this inform our understanding of how faith interacts with secular authority?
Ooh, that's a question we could spend hours unpacking.
I know, right?
It's definitely relevant to, the challenges we face today.
Absolutely. But speaking of challenges, we can't forget about Peter's denial.
Right.
Just as Jesus predicted, Peter, overcome with fear, denies knowing Jesus 3 times.
Yeah, this scene always gets me. You see Peter's bravado earlier on, boasting that he'll never abandon Jesus.
Right.
And then he just crumbles under pressure.
Yeah.
It's so human.
It is. It's so relatable.
We've all had those moments, haven't we?
Oh, yeah.
Where we don't live up to our own ideals.
Right.
Where fear or self-preservation, gets the better of us.
Yeah.
And Peter's denial is just this reminder that even the most devoted followers are capable of failing. I think that's what makes the story so powerful. It doesn't present us with these perfect heroes.
Right.
It shows us real people wrestling with doubt and fear and loyalty.
Exactly. And Matthew doesn't sugarcoat, Peter's remorse either.
No.
After that 3rd denial, the rooster crows, and Peter remembered the word of Jesus, and he went out and he wept bitterly.
Man, it's just gut-wrenching.
Yeah.
It really highlights the emotional toll of betrayal.
Yeah.
Not just for Jesus, but for those who loved him.
Right. And then in a detail unique to Matthew's gospel,
Yeah.
we get this story of Judas's remorse and suicide.
This is where things get really complicated.
Yeah.
You almost feel sympathy for Judas,
Right.
realizing the weight of what he's done.
Right.
But his actions have set in motion this whole tragedy. it's hard to reconcile.
It is a very challenging passage, and some interpret Judas's suicide as the sign of his ultimate despair, and others see it as an act of taking responsibility for his actions. And Matthew doesn't really offer us a clear judgment. He leaves it open to interpretation.
It's like he's saying, here's the story, here are the consequences, now you wrestle with the moral complexities.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us to one of the most pivotal scenes in the Passion narrative.
Okay.
Pilates' judgment.
Pilates' judgment.
Yeah,
this scene is so full of political intrigue. It's like a chess game.
It is, and so many ethical dilemmas.
Right.
You've got Pilate trying to appease the Jewish crowds, maintain order.
Right.
But also grappling with his own sense of what's right and wrong.
Yeah, it's a fascinating power struggle because Matthew really highlights how Pilate questions Jesus.
Right.
Almost like he's not entirely convinced of his guilt.
Right.
But he's also wary of challenging the religious authorities too much.
Right. And then you have that whole thing about his wife having a dream.
Oh, yeah.
Warning her about Jesus.
Right.
Just adding another layer of intrigue.
It's like he knows something's not right, but he's totally caught in the middle.
And of course, in the end, he washes his hands of the whole thing.
Right. Literally and figuratively.
Exactly. I am innocent of this man's blood.
But even as he's trying to absolve himself,
Right.
the crowd is crying out, his blood be on us and on our children.
Yeah, it's chilling.
It is.
Because it really underscores the gravity of what's about to happen and that choice.
Right.
It's not just Pilate's decision.
Right.
The crowd is complicit in this.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play
We do.
in, shaping the world around us.
Absolutely.
Our choices, whether big or small, they have ripple effects.
I do.
So from there, we move to the crucifixion itself, and Matthew doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't.
On the brutality of it all. Jesus is mocked, he's beaten, he's forced to carry his own cross to Golgotha
Right.
and crucified between two criminals.
Yeah, it's hard to read,
It is.
but it really brings home the immense suffering.
And then you have all these cosmic events that accompany his death.
Oh, yeah.
The darkness covering the land,
Right.
the tearing of the temple curtain,
Yeah.
the earthquake.
It's like creation itself is reacting to what's happening.
It's a disruption in the natural order.
Exactly.
And then those final words from Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Oh, yeah. One of the most famous sayings ever.
Right.
Just this cry of anguish that has echoed through the centuries.
But even in that moment, he's still addressing God as my God.
Right. It's a powerful expression of his humanity, that experience of abandonment and isolation.
Yeah.
But also this unwavering faith, even in the face of unimaginable pain.
It's a complex moment.
Yeah,
theologically.
It is.
How do you reconcile the idea of Jesus being both fully God
Right.
and fully human?
It's a mystery, and it's
Yeah.
one that theologians continue to grapple with, but I think Matthew is trying to show us that Jesus' divinity doesn't negate his human experience.
Yeah.
He suffered, he felt pain, he questioned, just like we do.
Right.
And that's what makes his sacrifice so relatable and so profound.
And then you have something that's unique to Matthew's gospel, the resurrection of the saints.
Yeah.
After Jesus dies, the tombs break open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's like this hint that Jesus' death isn't just a tragedy.
Right.
It's a victory. It's a triumph over death itself.
It adds this whole other layer of hope
It does.
to a story that's already, full of complex emotions.
Right.
So then we move on to the burial scene. And Joseph of Arimathea, who was like this secret follower of Jesus, steps forward
Right.
to claim the body.
Brave man.
I know, and lay it in his own tomb.
Yeah, and then Matthew adds another little detail that's so crucial for setting up the resurrection story.
Okay,
The guards at the tomb.
right, to prevent anyone from stealing the body.
Exactly. It's like he's anticipating those who are going to say, oh, the disciples just made this up.
Right.
So Matthew's crafting this really compelling argument for the truth of the resurrection.
Right.
He's anticipating the questions and the challenges that are going to come.
So as we kind of wrap up our look at Matthew's passion, what are some of the key takeaways that stick with you?
That's a great question.
What did Matthew want his readers to understand about Jesus and his mission?
Well, I think one of the central themes is this fulfillment of prophecy. You know,
Yeah.
throughout the narrative, Matthew's drawing all these connections between Jesus' experiences and the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah.
It's like he's saying this isn't just a random story. This is all part of God's plan.
Exactly. And another key takeaway is the emphasis on Jesus' humanity. You know, Matthew doesn't shy away from portraying his emotions, his struggles, his suffering,
Right.
which makes the sacrifice all the more relatable and meaningful.
And even though it's a story about death, there's this underlying thread of hope
Absolutely.
throughout it all.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus' death isn't the end. It's the beginning of something new.
Right, it's the start of a new covenant, a new relationship between God and humanity, and that message continues to resonate with people you know, of all faiths and backgrounds. It's this really powerful story about love and sacrifice and the triumph of hope over despair.
I love that. Well said.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
It's been an amazing journey through Matthew's passion narrative.
Yeah, I love this stuff.
Me too. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration has provided some new insights and maybe sparked a deeper appreciation for this powerful story.
Absolutely.
As you continue to reflect on Matthew's gospel, we leave you with this question.
Okay.
What aspects of the passion narrative resonate most deeply with you?
Hmm.
And how does this story shape your understanding of faith, sacrifice, and the human experience?
Great question.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.